Welcome, everybody. I think it's time for us to get started. My name is Brian McKinney, and I'm president of ICEsoft Technologies, and I'm going to be your host for today's event. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy day to attend this session of our ICEsoft webinar series. I'm very pleased to have with us today Jeffrey Hammond and Michael Facemire of Forrester Research. They'll be sharing their insights and experiences on a particularly relevant topic to all of us these days, aligning your enterprise mobility strategy. So now, without any further ado, I will like to hand the presentation over to Jeffrey.
Thanks a lot, Brian. I really appreciate it. And we're really happy to be here today. And we've been spending a lot of time with our clients who have had a lot of questions when it comes not just to building mobile apps, but building mobile apps that work within the enterprise context that really create value for customers and employees and business partners alike. So to get started, I think I'm actually going to turn things over to my partner in crime here, the Clyde, I guess, to my Bonnie. I'm not sure how that works out, Mike, but anyway, why don't you go ahead and take it away with our initial slide.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely honored to be the Clyde side of that, but we'll leave that discussion till a little bit later. But so yeah, as Jeffrey said, talking to our clients on a daily basis, often the initial question comes about how do I build a mobile app, and a conversation or a few days of conversation later, it ends up being, how do I build a modern application? And Jeffrey's written a good bit about this, and I have as well. Mobile tends to not be just a new front end. It's not just a new browser or a new interface. It's a new way to do the full technology stack. And so I've captured here the four major challenges that I hear that sum that up, that I hear about almost every day. The first is that of backend integration and federation. How do I get access to enterprise data? And then once I have access to it, how do I ensure that it's in the proper format that mobile needs? Because often our backends we built on a SOA infrastructure. We had an assumption that the browser would be the one consuming this data, and that the machine that the browser was on had a very fixed pipe with a fat network, and we could be very chatty and things like that, when that's not always the case. And so we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but that's the first big challenge that we run into. The second is that of channel security. How do I secure the data over the wire, and how do I secure data once it's on the device? And that gets into the mobile application management, mobile device management questions. The third is the one that I said generally leads off these discussions, which is which client-side technology should I use? Should I build a native app, or should I build a mobile web application, or should I use one of these hybrid technologies like PhoneGap, or maybe a cross-compilation one like Xamarin or others? And then, do I use the same one of those technologies for each of the platforms that are out there? Is Android going to win, or is iOS going to win, or how is the third party like Microsoft going to make a play here? And I'll tell you in short that it's not a zero-sum game. That you have to understand who your audience is, but that's the third big challenge that we see. And then the fourth one is, how do I build my development organization, and how do I create methodologies within that organization to ensure that I deliver these mobile experiences on the time frame that the business wants them? And that's what we see is the underlying factor behind all four of these, is it has to be done fast. When I started as a professional developer myself, and this has been now, almost 15 years ago, we had a very well-defined waterfall process. The enterprise software development cycle ran roughly 12 to 18 months long, and it was a very systematic way of developing software. Well, now we're seeing development time frames range anywhere between a month to 3 months to 4 months, and so therefore, to meet that time frame, thing needs, how we do development needs to change quickly. And so I would say that most every mobile development and mobile strategy decision that I work with our clients on is driven by time to market.
And Mike, it's funny, I can almost determine where a client or where a development shop is by which of these questions they are asking. If the question that I get is about client-side technologies, well, should we go native, or should we use HTML5, or should we, do something in between, or should we use this tool or that tool? I almost know that they're still at the starting point of the mobile journey, because honestly, that question is less important than some of the other ones that you've talked about, back-end integration and federation. And it's very common that I'll talk to an organization where the marketing team went off and they hired a design agency, and the design agency said, oh, you should build this application using this technology, and they say okay, and they go do it, and then they get that initial app out for a campaign or something like that, and then they say, okay, well, what if we actually started to inject personalization into this, or we started to enable a customer to see their history because we wanted to add a loyalty component. And they haven't thought about that back-end integration or federation at all, and they run smack into a wall because their systems aren't set up to provide access to that information, or they didn't budget to do regular updates to the application. They thought it was going to be a one and done, and so all of a sudden they're watching their application drop from maybe a 4-star app to a 3-star app, and then a couple months later it starts getting 2 stars because it hasn't been updated because they didn't think about the delivery and the organization challenges. So I often like to flip this construct on its head and tell organizations that to be successful in the long term, they have to start with that idea of how are we going to go fast on a regular basis. What we are seeing in the mobile space right now is that the velocity that the business demands, and more importantly, that your customers and employees expect, is probably beyond anything that you are used to doing in your traditional IT systems, in the traditional systems that you give to your customer service reps that interact directly with your customers. I did a piece of research about 18 months ago where we went out and we talked to a bunch of companies that had built very highly rated applications that were available in the Apple App Store, the Android Play Store, the Microsoft Store, and we asked them, well, how do you build these applications? What do you do? What are your processes? What really helps you be successful? And one of the almost universal things that we heard was that these companies do somewhere on the order of 8 to 12 releases a year. At that velocity, if you do the math, it's about 1 release every 4 to 5 weeks. And unless you've designed an organization to hit that level of velocity, it's going to be hard to get those sorts of high ratings over time as your competition puts new features in that are better than what you have, as customer expectations shift, as new devices are released, as the platforms that your customers are using evolve and they switch from one platform to another. So this velocity, this need for velocity, obliterates traditional development processes. I've made a list here of some of the things that just don't work very well when you are trying to be successful with enterprise mobile applications. As Mike talked about, he started off doing waterfall-based development. Well, I would tell you at this point, even iterative development doesn't work very well in the mobile space. If you have a design group that is separate from a development group, and they go off and they do their ethnography and they do persona design, and then they throw all that over the wall after a 5 to 6 week period to the dev team, it's just going to be it's going to take you too long to get that application out, especially if what they designed isn't very easy to build when you're doing development. Likewise, doing all your development and then throwing it over the wall to a testing center of excellence doesn't work. So vertically structured organizations that are built around a center of excellence model, which a lot of IT shops have, are going to create friction points when you are trying to achieve the level of velocity required to build really good mobile applications. We also find that traditional models that kind of put the developers in the back office and keep them separate from the customers, and that all customer input is filtered through business analysts or product managers, that model doesn't work very well either, especially when that feedback is publicly available, viewable upon the App Store. At a minimum, an enterprising developer is going to go out and look at the ratings that the application that they've built has gotten. So why not formalize that process and find a way to get feedback directly into the development team as quickly as possible, and look for developers that are capable of acting on that feedback without having it be filtered. I mentioned testing. The reality is, if you leave your testing to the end of the cycle, you're really going to have some difficulties, because testing is very different. It's much more technical. The scope and the breadth of the different devices that you have to test on are dramatically larger. As part of this move toward a more rapid development, that upfront big 100-page requirements docs and requirements management tools that you see in traditional ALM environments also doesn't work very well. We see teams moving to a much more visual process, using wireframes, using journey maps to look at cross-channel experiences. Those are the types of things that you really don't see captured in the traditional Word-based requirements specification. Another thing that we commonly see is that organizations that are successful in the mobile enterprise space have borrowed from ISVs, and they implement betas. They use beta platforms because you want to make sure that you work on the latest releases, and they also do betas themselves and collect feedback on those betas, because you don't want to ship something very, very quickly only to find that you have regressions that depress your ratings even further. So these are just some of the ways that we see mobile application development changing and having a major effect on development organizations at the enterprise level. Brian, I think you've also seen a couple of things in the work that you're doing with your customers. I wonder if you'd like to share some of that as well.
Yeah, we certainly are seeing, the velocity pressures. And I think the one thing I would add to the list you have is that there seems to be an evolving dynamic within larger enterprises too, in terms of where these applications are getting done and built. We're seeing almost, a sort of a split between the conventional IT organizations that have a certain mandate and develop a different kind of application, and then we're seeing a lot more of the business units developing their own applications. And so this bifurcation, or this splitting as to the origins and who's driving the development of the application, I think adds an additional layer of stress to the corporation. Not only do you have to, build that successful structure geared at velocity, as you indicated, you now have to kind of do this across, multiple development shops within the same organization sometimes.
Yeah, I'm seeing that as well. Sometimes it'll be a third party. I see a lot of marketing and sales organizations going out and hiring digital agencies to do that work, or even hiring their own shadow IT development shops, if you will. And it's not because necessarily that they want to do that, but they feel like they have to do that to meet the demands of the customers, especially if they have a centralized IT organization that's not responsive to their needs. So increasing velocity is one of those most important challenges if you want to be successful in mobile enterprise development. I would certainly agree with you there.
Yeah, and it's just trying to manage that space, across the two. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I actually want to say that things are even a little bit worse than what I said on that slide, because if you say, well, 8 to 12 releases a year, that's one every 4 to 6 weeks, that's actually not how we tend to see mobile application development teams release. They don't necessarily use a clockwork schedule that says at the end of the month we're putting a new build out. In fact, we see releases tend to cluster. You'll see maybe a minimum viable product that comes out very quickly. Teams will learn a lot about what they built, what works, what doesn't work, and that'll be followed up by a rapid release. And here's something that actually is a little bit comforting. Even the best mobile app development teams out there make mistakes, regressions get introduced, or a new device comes out that has a bug that's specific to that platform or that release of an operating system. And so a patch that goes out as quickly as possible is something that teams have to put out. So what I would really tell you is that you need to get to a point where you can release on demand. Sometimes that's within a couple days. If you can get to the point where you can stabilize an app and you're getting 4- and 5-star ratings consistently, and that allows you to have a little bit of a longer gap while you do the next major version, count yourself lucky. It does happen, but you know, these periods of stabilization and periods of rapid release are what you need to be thinking about as the end game in designing an application development organization. Now, I want to switch a little bit and start talking about some of the technology pieces, because I think we've covered the development process and governance piece pretty well so far. Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you to start, though.
Absolutely. And so as we talked about early on, you know, the client side gets a lot of the focus. It's what's talked about a lot in the media, but it's only half the challenge. But it's still half. So let's look at what that half is. So the known part of this is the fact that there are just so many devices. If you look at the number of devices globally, namely Android, but it's not always going to be an Android thing. I definitely see the Apple device ecosystem starting to grow in number this year as well. But just the sheer number of devices out there, and then multiply that by the fact that each device has a portrait mode and a landscape mode, and then each of these devices have multiple pixel densities on their screen. I mean, as a visual developer and a visual designer, it's almost maddening to figure out how to support all those. And then there's also the different client technologies. We talked about that at the beginning. You know, there's the native path, the mobile web path, and then somewhere in the middle, the hybrid path, when I can mix web views within a native interface. And so a lot of the folks will come to us and say, well, we'll just embrace the mobile web. We'll embrace HTML5 because it's the magic bullet. You know, it's the write once, run anywhere. When in reality, it's not. It means write once and function everywhere, but it might not give you the most ideal experience. And then even with that said, there are challenges with the mobile web. So for example, the number of JavaScript libraries that I come across every day is crazy. You know, as a self-professed developer myself, or a recovering enterprise developer, I feel sorry for those folks that do this every single day, because even in the few hours per day or per week that I spend writing mobile code, it's almost impossible to keep up with all the new libraries that show up. And then when you go to test and do QA, there are all the browsers that I need to worry about. And then so some folks say, well, we'll solve the browser problem by simply supporting WebKit, and then the rest can kind of fend for themselves. But now WebKit is being forked into Blink by Google, and then each of the other browsers have their own proprietary tags that they use for their specific version of the device or for their specific browser. So simply saying that mobile web is going to solve our problem, that's not the case either. And then there's unique device features. So how do I interact with the GPS on one device versus another, and how do I interact with with beacon support on iOS versus Bluetooth LE on Android? So the client side is really tough, and then we've got things like offline, and I'll tell you, offline is one of the ones that I hear about quite a bit. People always want offline support, and then when I talk about the challenges of creating a store and forward architecture, creating a mechanism to store up local transactions and then deliver them when you have a network connection, and ensure that you don't have collisions on the back end and having to figure out which one wins. Once you start going down that rabbit hole, it turns into a very, very difficult engineering challenge very, very quickly.
Yeah, didn't you do that at some point? I thought you were part of the Lotus Notes team.
I was, and I'll say that I feel that we had done a really good job, but even we had known holes where those synchronization mechanisms were broken, and so this is a challenge that in the industry I don't know that anybody has ever truly fully solved.
I certainly think that folks have gotten close. I want to put a little bit of a color to the first point that you said, multiple devices, and it's an important point because it's really a watershed for most IT organizations. If you think about how enterprise development shops function, they function primarily through control mechanisms, and what I mean by that is by reducing the scope of the problem, by putting constraints in place. You reduce the surface of complexity that you have to support. I'll give you an example. For years, we saw lots and lots of shops where they supported any client as long as it was Windows XP Service Pack 3, and they supported any browser as long as it was IE6. And because we saw organizations that didn't upgrade those operating systems or those browsers for years, they were able to use those constraints to their advantage to reduce complexity. That works great when your IT department can specify exactly what operating systems and browsers and devices you will support. But the reality is, as we are way past that, I'm not even sure how successful we ever were in the mobile space with dictating what platforms would be supported. If you look at Android alone, this chart from the OpenSignal group is an interesting one because it lays out all the permutations of Android across different devices that you need to be prepared to support if you want to build a global application that reaches the largest addressable population of customers. Now, the reality is I don't know a single client of ours that tests for all these different combinations. In fact, what's fairly typical is they'll test for a couple hero devices, maybe the Galaxy S4, now the Galaxy S5, the HTC One, and then they'll test for iOS devices, and then they'll release. Well, how can you justify doing that if there are this many potential permutations that you're going to support? And that's one of the big differences we see with enterprise development in the mobile space as opposed to the traditional desktop space, is folks use affirmative testing up front, but then they also use metric collection and analysis of crashes after the release to isolate point problems. So essentially, it's giving up control. It's trusting that the platform vendors are going to try to keep their platforms as consistent as possible, and recognizing that there are going to be gaps and regressions and problems that slip through in this sort of environment where you don't have control. So the ability to fix those issues quickly, as fast as possible after the fact, as opposed to affirmatively testing for months before the fact, in the meantime new devices are coming out and old devices are getting replaced, is the only way that we can work. And it's one of several examples of how things need to change. You need to give up the control and constraints of traditional development and embrace the capability to recover rapidly in a high velocity environment. Now, let's take a look at some of what Mike said about different technology options and HTML versus native versus hybrids. There are essentially 5 different strategies that you can employ when it comes to building mobile clients. Of course, you can build native applications on the individual platforms. You can take the HTML5 approach, and increasingly, when we see people doing HTML5, they're using a technique called responsive web design, where they will use a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation that can adjust the display of the website based on the size of the device and the screen that is given to the developer. In addition to those two ends, we see 3 kind of in-between styles for development. There are mobile middleware tools that will allow you to build a code base once and then we'll cross-compile it or optimize it for specific devices. And then there are JavaScript frameworks that can be used to build an experience that is more app-like and less web-like. And those experiences can also be delivered in a container. We call those JavaScript applications delivered in a container hybrids. And hybrids are really interesting because they take on some of the qualities both of a native application and of a web-based application. And we'll talk about what those are in the next couple slides. So native application strategies. In general, we would recommend a native app strategy when you absolutely have to have a pixel-perfect experience. A year or two ago, one of the stories that we saw across the news was that Facebook was moving toward entire native application development. And, folks said, well, that means that you have to go native, because if Facebook's going native, then that means that it's best. You have to think about their context. Facebook saw more and more of its traffic going to mobile devices, the majority of the traffic. They also saw that on average, their customers were spending at least an hour a day on Facebook. They also don't have other channels through which they interact with customers. So the digital channel is the only way that they get a customer experience. You put those three things together, you look at the resources they have, and they concluded it was worth investing in 3 separate code bases to do native applications because that was essentially the thing that completely defined their user experience. That may not be the case for your business.
Yeah, and Jeffrey, I'll jump in there. It definitely made all the media rounds, and I'll say that when that decision happened, along with LinkedIn's decision, as they bounced back and forth between native and a hybrid platform, is that the other thing to keep in mind is don't always believe what you hear in the media, because a lot of folks said, well, Facebook left because the performance on the mobile web was bad, and therefore I heard a lot of questions about, well, if you want anything that's performant, you can't use the mobile web, or you can't use hybrid, which is completely untrue. Generally when folks say that to me, I ask, well, is your web browser fast enough? Because that's the technology that drives it. So, don't rely on just what you hear there, because in the end, a bad developer will write bad code, and so sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes you get bad performance.
And it's not like there's not hundreds of thousands of so-so native applications out on the various app stores, right, Mike?
Exactly. That perform poorly and have a bad experience. Absolutely.
Exactly. So the other time that we'll see folks use native applications are when they really need that advanced support for device-centric applications. A casual game is a good example. I might want to play Angry Birds for 6 hours on an airplane flight from Boston to San Francisco, and I'm not going to have any network connection because I'm flying on an American MD-80, which doesn't have a wireless access. In that case, a native application is very well probably going to be the best way to deliver that experience, because it really is a standalone single-player game. But there are other cases where people expect a network connection in order to be able to function. A mobile banking application is a great example. If I'm not connected to the web, I don't expect to be able to get my latest balance. I don't expect to be able to transfer money from checking to savings. So in that case, other technologies are equally appropriate. If you're trying to do deep on-device integration, like with beacons as an example, you're probably going to want to take advantage of the native SDKs that support that sort of functionality right now. The big challenge with building native is that you are going to end up with a separate code base on every single platform. It's going to be in C# for Windows, it's going to be in Objective-C for iOS, it's going to be in Java for Android. Hopefully you don't have to go to the in-car platforms or the smart TV platforms. But I have to tell you, maintaining and introducing new features across multiple code bases simultaneously, the SCM discipline alone required to do that is a real challenge, and it slows you down, it defeats this high velocity environment, and you have to put significantly more resources on your mobile application development efforts if you decide that this is the way that you're going to go. The other thing is you need to make sure that you're prepared to do 2 to 3 updates a year per platform. When iOS 7 comes out, your app better work with it on the day that it's released. If not, you're going to see a serious impact in your customer ratings of your application. And I know there were apps on my iPad that broke the day that I upgraded to iOS 7 and did not function correctly. So there was obviously not proactive testing going on there on the parts of those particular applications. Now, let's go to the other extreme, the web approach. Now, it's interesting, I've got a picture up here of Starbucks, and you might say, well, why do you have Starbucks up here? They have a great native app. And you're right, they do have a great native app. But that doesn't mean that they can't build some sort of experience when a customer opens up the browser on a device and points it at the Starbucks domain. So this kind of is the answer to one of those questions. Well, do I go native or do I do HTML5? You're probably going to need both apps and a mobile web experience. They may do different things, but if you go with the native technology, you may still find yourself maintaining a base of mobile optimized web content as well. Now, when it comes to web experiences, we see that web experiences are perfectly acceptable for glanceable experiences. If I'm going to interact with a site for 30 or 40 seconds, I just want a single piece of information, and then I'm going to move on. So an alert or a workflow approval would be a really great example of something that could easily be delivered with a mobile web experience. Situational applications, things like campaigns or seasonal applications that don't necessarily have a long lifespan, or even if you're testing to see whether or not an application is going to make sense, and you don't want to invest the time in all the native development before you get some initial customer feedback on how often folks are going to use the application. In general, we find that responsive design seems to be the evolving paradigm here, with more and more organizations picking it up as opposed to a progressive enhancement or a graceful degradation approach. And that's because we see more and more folks practicing mobile-first design as opposed to mobile-after design, where they shift the experience and try to shrink and squeeze it onto the mobile device. The other nice thing about the web strategy is that from a security standpoint, from a manageability standpoint, it's not that different than managing your existing desktop targeted site today. You update content by putting it up onto the app server. You can test content, do A/B testing or multivariate testing by routing browser traffic appropriately. And when you get to devices like tablets, we actually find that the additional space makes it possible to use some of the more traditional web layouts, like a two-column nav, or a nav pane on the left and then a content pane on the right. So you can do this successfully. Mike, I don't know, do you have any additional comments about that?
No, that definitely all makes good sense, and as you pointed out, the responsive design is definitely really becoming very, very successful, but we're also so incredibly new into it, and finding folks that are really good with JavaScript, and especially folks that are good with JavaScript and CSS3. That's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. Those folks are a bit rare. So as you go down this path, driving for a great experience and hoping that responsive design is going to lead you there is definitely technically possible, but from an implementation perspective, maybe a bit of a challenge.
Right. So that brings us to the hybrid, which is somewhere in between these two. Hybrids take web content and mix it in either in a simple container that has some very basic bridging to on-device functions, or we also see what I would call a complex hybrid, which is a combination of native code and web views that have parts of the code base which is consistent across all devices, and then other parts which are optimized for the individual devices. We see hybrids getting device access like apps by bridging to the native operating systems and to the native SDKs. These are really, really good. This is a good strategy if you want to build that connected experience. So the mobile banking application, the customer loyalty application, the order tracking application. The other nice thing is that a lot of the investments that you might make originally in a web-based mobile experience can then be repackaged into a hybrid application, because in a sense it's just an HTML rendering engine. It just doesn't have the Chrome around it that a mobile browser has. The other advantage of a hybrid is that you can fatten or thin the app over time. So you can write a native routine to do something like image capture. And then as the HTML5 standards advanced and that sort of API gets standardized and all the different browsers get access to that and it becomes into the web view, you can shift that back into JavaScript code that you can maintain in common across all the different devices. And going back to this point about good experiences, there are absolutely applications in the app stores today which are 4+ rated applications which give great customer experiences that are built on hybrid technology. I've got an example of one here called Untapped, one of my personal favorite applications, but there are also many others, including enterprise apps that we see the largest of companies building. The last point that I would make on the client side is this, again, going back to this idea of mobile destroying your control over clients. the speed of updating. This graphic is from when iOS 7 was introduced last year in the September timeframe. Within 3 days of the introduction, we saw overall penetration at the client level approach more than 50%, which drives home the point to why you have to be doing your testing and why you have to be working with beta platforms before the release, because this could be consumers, but it could also just as easily be your employees. If they're using their own devices, you're not going to prevent them from upgrading to the latest version of platforms when they come out. So do your homework beforehand, get involved in platform betas, and make sure that your apps, if you're building them, work on the latest software. So when you think about the technology to apply, you need to ask yourself, do you have the people, the tools, and the process to simultaneously develop, test, and release a feature across multiple code bases and do it 8 to 12 times a year? If you do and you've got the resources, great. What I would suggest is finding a way to make as much of that code base a single code base in common across multiple platforms is going to help you achieve the velocity that your business is going to demand. Brian, I think that's probably what you're starting to see from your customers that are adopting tools like Bridget, correct?
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. This is a particularly relevant question, and it's certainly representative of the feedback and the concerns that we hear from organizations we interact with and the problems we're trying to address. A couple of other points I think that are worth highlighting here is I really think that this is a beatable challenge, right? But in order to do so, as you pointed out, companies really need to focus on selecting a technology, I guess, that utilizes a more web-centric approach, particularly one that's maybe standards-based, and this will allow you to really leverage your existing investments in staff, training, and tools, and should reduce the magnitude of that challenge. So if you can pull it down to that kind of single code base. The second point I'd like to make really deals with the nature of hybrid solutions, and both you and Michael have kind of touched on this. Conventional hybrid technologies are typically a blend of kind of a web-centric design and development approach with a native-based deployment model. So both PhoneGap and Coney are probably great examples of this approach, and they're great in that they allow you to realize the advantages of a web-based front end and consolidating some of the code base to an extent. But really where it falls apart, at least for us, is in the deployment and distribution phase, because for virtually all of the hybrid solutions out there, you still have to take the apps you develop, as you point out, and embed them in some kind of a container for deployment directly onto the mobile devices. And what this means is that you're still faced with this challenge of having to manage your way through multiple App Store submissions, and you have to manage and support and maintain thousands of these different application instances across multiple platforms. So you never get to fully realize the cost and simplicity advantages that you might get with a pure web-based deployment model. And this is really where ICEsoft has been able, this is what ICEsoft has been able to bring to the table is with products like Bridget that we have, we've eliminated the requirement for enterprises to have to do container deployment on hybrid models. So with ICEsoft, you have a chance to reap the benefits and the simplicity of a full web-based cost structure, without sacrificing capability. And in our minds, this represents a change in the kind of that hybrid design paradigm, and it does so in a very positive way. So, we're encouraged by the hybrid approach, and we'd certainly like to see people take a look at some of these products.
Cool. I think we probably have beat the client side to death here, Mike. So I'm going to turn it back to you because you are Mr. Infrastructure, Mobile Infrastructure as a Service, and ask you to highlight some of the server-side challenges that we see right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest one is, for most of the folks listening here that aren't in startups, that don't have any legacy, the biggest thing is, we've built our infrastructure over time with tons and tons of quote-unquote new technology. It was new when we got it and implemented it, but what that means is we've got just a multitude of disparate backends that use disparate data protocols, and how do I access SAP? How do I access a SQL database? And what's the different security parameters for each? As much as the the client-side matrix was difficult. The server-side matrix isn't that far behind. And so if you really start to look at what that, if we wanted to visualize what that looks like, as you see here, we've got all of our back-end systems of record, our line of business apps, our content management, our HR systems, CRM systems, and they use data protocols like you see here with things like SOAP and XML-RPC and maybe some messaging technologies and SQL. And the important thing is there that isn't that you know what all those are or the nuances between them. That's a conversation better served with beers at a bar. But the important thing there is that the set of technologies there don't match the ones at the top, which are the ones that that mobile clients today want to consume. Very lightweight technologies like JSON or a lightweight XML, using architectures like REST and security infrastructures like OAuth and OAuth 2. So we have a chasm in the middle that we really need to jump across, and this is the crux of the enterprise backend challenge. So if we then look at how that chasm is being crossed today, this is what we see, and if you think about it, this is actually not too different than we had when we wanted to web enable the world. And when we web enabled it, that middle layer oftentimes was an ESB or some other type of normalization technology. But now in mobile, what we're seeing is these multiple business applications, access to them and the data protocols they produce can all be normalized through a RESTful API layer. And then for the front ends like mobile and maybe some other smaller ones like Google Glass, you can actually have some mobile SDKs or some native libraries or JavaScript libraries that give you access to these backend services. And by doing this, what you've done is you've told the mobile developer, do what you do best. Create a great experience. Really focus on that engaging, enveloping experience. And when it comes to accessing backend stuff, backend data, backend business processes, here's an object. Here's an object that looks just like a local object that might do something on the device. But what that object that we give you, what it does is it proxies access to the backend server, and it marshals the data over the wire, so you don't have to worry about doing these data protocol transformations and things like that. So what this mobile SDK library plus the RESTful API underneath, what that does is it bridges that gap that was in the middle. And so therefore it allows a mobile developer to focus on just what they do best, which is mobile development. Brian, what are your folks seeing there? Is this kind of what's ringing true? Are you seeing the same thing in the marketplace today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this issue you bring up with the challenges related to infrastructure and legacy and crossing that divide, I think it's perhaps one of the most under-recognized and underappreciated challenges facing mobile enterprise today. We know that enterprises have tremendous investment in their back-end infrastructure, and they have to do the certification and testing pretty extensively. And when you have something working, the last thing you really want to do is to kind of have to rip it up or rip it apart or reintegrate new technologies into it if you can avoid it. And one of the things we focused on here at ICEsoft with our Java EE mobility products is to try and keep those mobilization efforts isolated to the presentation layer if possible. And it works for us in our Java EE products. And we really developed a bunch of technology that combines device detection and auto-theming and automatically incorporates responsive web design capabilities to simplify the task. So the result is that you don't have to muck with the back-end systems in order to mobilize your application. So this is more if you have an existing application, you're looking to migrate it into the mobile space. And one of the side benefits of being able to incorporate those features is that it really resolves a lot of your BYOD challenges, and if you can manage to keep all those mobilization efforts constrained into a presentation layer, your life is going to be a heck of a lot simpler, and you're going to save a considerable amount of time and money when it comes to mobilizing as you move forward.
Which again results in higher velocity delivery capabilities.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think in our mind, in our conclusion, that's being able to isolate that to some degree and keep it in that presentation layer if at all possible. It's one of the key elements that allows you to hit those velocity numbers you're shooting for.
Yep, absolutely. And you nailed it. You know, what we like to hear about and see in the press is you know, how a lot of the really glamorous, sexy challenges of the front end, but the hardest ones, I absolutely agree. The hardest and ugliest ones are the ones you're going to run into in your back end. So just to finish up on those server-side challenges, we talked about the multitude of systems, the disparate data protocols. You know, personalization, how do we personalize an experience? Oftentimes that means we need to, you know, pull from a multitude of different systems depending on the incoming context of the mobile device or mobile browser. Adding security to this. A lot of times folks have some very, very intricate security models that work well for the web, but these same things, these very chatty, you know, multi-way communications don't work at all for mobile. And if they're session-based, mobile devices, you've got to assume that mobile devices are on transient networks. So session-based security protocols tend to be pretty ugly in mobile. And then finally, how do you compose internal services with third-party services and bring them together all under a single request? This is another server-side challenge. So don't think the challenges stop at the client side. The really nasty, really ugly ones are on the server side as well.
So obviously we could talk about this kind of stuff all day long and what we see folks doing, but we're running out of time here. So just to kind of pull things together, if you want to be successful in your enterprise mobility efforts, make sure that yes, you focus on customer experience, but that you also keep in mind the issues with cost that your choices are going to result in, and that you're designing an organization that is going to meet the velocity that is expected by customers and demanded by your business sponsors. Make sure that you organize your teams for that level of velocity. Small, tightly focused, cross-functional teams that are working with IT organizations that are providing mobile infrastructure services to enable their actions with connectivity to their existing systems of record. Make sure that you have the hybrid approach on your list. It's not just native or web. Hybrid is a third way that allows you to gain many of the benefits of native apps and mobile web as well. Make sure that you are making the requisite investments in integration to that back-end data, and that you're thinking about how that's going to happen early in the process, not after you've already built an application and you're getting immediate demands for that data next week when you haven't put any integration framework in place. And if you can solve that data access challenge, if you can enrich the client work that you are doing with timely, accurate, up-to-date data, you can begin to create breakthrough experiences that go well beyond pretty pixels and really start to deliver on the power that we're seeing with the mobile mind shift. So with that, I'd like to really thank our hosts, Brian, on behalf of Mike and I. I think you have a couple things that you just want to say about how you're solving some of these challenges for your customers.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for this. So as we wrap up the presentation side of things here, I did have a couple of slides on information slides I did want to pass along. If people are looking to mobilize their enterprise applications, we have a number of solutions at ICEsoft that are currently out there with customers right now. But there were two products in particular that I thought were really germane to the discussion we've been having here today. And so the first one is ICEmobile. And ICEmobile is really about mobility for Java EE. And it's what we believe is the simplest way to really mobilize a Java EE application, whether it's your existing one or not, or if you're designing new. It is a hybrid solution. It does support containerization, but its primary focus is really a web-centric approach. So, you know, we stay on that presentation layer to resolve your back-end challenges to the extent we can. We are standards-based to address some of the training and the resourcing challenges we discussed. And we support and we automatically do responsive and adaptive designs. And that really allows you to better integrate that mobile and desktop experience. And to learn more about ICEmobile, I'd point you at icesoft.org or the product URL below. And we have a bunch of terrific videos and demos that you can get your head wrapped around. And then questions and emails can go to product.support@icesoft.com. Next slide. And the second product we alluded to today is called Bridget, and this is really an easy way to add native features to web applications. It's also a hybrid solution, but it's hybrid in a different way, as I alluded to there with my discussion earlier. And it works with any web-based application framework, not just Java EE. And it allows that web-centric deployment model to occur, and that really delivers that better cost profile and allows you to hit that velocity target that you need to hit. As a result, there's no App Store deployment headaches, there's no client management headaches, there's no unique skill sets required. And again, I'd encourage you to visit us at www.bridget.mobi.com or bridget.mobi. And again, we have a bunch of demo videos there, and this thing is dead simple to get you up and started with. So, Jeffrey, I guess back to you for the wrap-up.
Thanks a lot. And I think we'll take questions now. We've got a few minutes if there are any online.